What's up everybody, welcome back. So let's continue working on our turret today, and we kind of have the basics for it pretty much set up. So I don't want to make this turret too much more complicated, to be honest. Instead, I would like to move on to another AI that can actually move around and is a bit more human-like, and we can add other functionalities in there. So what we're going to do for this turret, as I promised, we're going to make this replicate. So right now, if we start to use this in a multiplayer game, we're going to run into all sorts of problems. So that's what we're going to take a look at today. If you like the series, please consider leaving a like. And if you want to get the project files for yourself, you can become a member of the channel or become a Patreon, and then you will get access to premium channels in the Discord and also downloads for the premium project files. This project will be uploaded when the tutorial series is done. So with all of that stuff out of the way, let's start making this turret replicate. So let's take a look at our turret, and as I mentioned, if we launch this in a multiplayer game, then we are going to run into issues. So let's set it to 2 players and make sure that we have a listen server enabled here, so we actually spawn together in the level. And as you can see over here, the right side is the client and the left side is the host. And for the client, there isn't really much happening. So although for the host everything is working and the client will receive damage, he doesn't know that he's being shot at. So we need to replicate everything that we did, and that's actually not too bad. So let's open our turret. And we can actually divide this in a few different sections. So first of all, if we want to replicate something, we need to take a look at FX and animations and sounds that we're playing, because all of those are never replicated by default. So if we want to make something a multiplayer and we are spawning FX or using sounds or anything like that, we need to make that replicate ourselves. So that's one part that we need to take care of, the FX that we're spawning and all of that kind of stuff. So the animations as well, as I mentioned, and that also goes for the animation blueprint. So that's something we need to take a look at. Then we are spawning the projectile, and that's a second blueprint that we're spawning. So every time in multiplayer that we're spawning something, we also need to make sure that is set up correctly for replication. And then the last thing we want to take a look at is the actual logic that we're running, and we need to make sure that is actually working in multiplayer as well. But that's not too bad, but I'll get back to that in a little bit. First of all, we're going to take a look at the animation stuff. And as you might remember from the first episode, we made all of these variables over here, and I put them in the animation blueprint category. So these variables actually drive the animation blueprint, and the animation blueprint is something that exists on every instance of the game. So it's the same as your normal player character, for example. Every player character that is in the game will have its own instance of an animation blueprint in that game. So this will make it that you don't really need to replicate anything on the actual animation blueprint, as long as you make sure that all of the variables that will drive the information in the blueprint are replicated. So that way the information that all of the clients will receive is the same, and the outcome of the animation blueprint will be the same as well. So for the animation blueprint, there's actually no replication involved inside of the actual AnimBP. We're simply going to grab all of these variables inside of the AnimBP category, and we're going to set them to replicate. So replicate it. And we have the is aiming, is shield open, is firing, the current target location and the current target distance. So in case you didn't put them in a category, I'm naming them for you. So we have the turret damage value, and then the play hit react animation, the hit react animation variation, and the last one is the turret damage variation. So if we set all of this to replicate, and we make sure that all of the code that we're running is actually run from the server, so these variables will replicate, then the animation blueprint will work. So the part with the code running server side, we're going to get back to that. We have the variable set up and good to go. So the next thing we want to take a look at, as I mentioned, are the FX that we're spawning. And if we were using sounds, then we also need to replicate the sounds that we're spawning. So unfortunately, there are no sounds included in the pack, so we have to do without, but we can do the FX part. And for the sounds, that would work in the same way, to be honest. So there's multiple ways you can do it. We could use multicast events, but in this case, for most of the FXs, I'm gonna use a rep notify, simply because that's a little bit cheaper in a multiplayer game. So whenever you can use a rep notify, make sure you use one. So we're gonna start in the start combat state event, and if we scroll to the right a little bit, over here we're spawning the first FX, so the FX exposed. And as I mentioned, I'm going to use a rep notify. So if you're not familiar with a rep notify, that's a variable that will fire a notify as soon as it's been changed. So it's kind of like a multicast event, or you can set different replication conditions, by the way, so it doesn't actually have to replicate to all instances, but that's a little bit more advanced. So by default, when the variable is changed by the server, all of the clients will be notified that the variable changed. So we can use booleans to fire our fx, for example. So I'm going to create a new variable, a boolean, and call this one play exposed fx. So we're going to keep it a bool. We're going to set it to replicate over here. Sorry, we're going to set it to rep notify over here. And as soon as you do that, it will create a new function called onRepPlayExposedFX, and this function will fire when the server changes the variable. There is one little side note: the variable actually does need to change for the repNotify function to fire. So if we have this boolean, it's already set to true, and we have the server set it to true again, there will be no notify for the clients. This will only fire if it changes from true to false or the other way around. So we're going to use this boolean. If we're going to set the boolean to true, we're going to spawn the fx, and if we set it to false, we're going to delete the fx. So first of all, let's just grab a setter over here. We're going to set it to true. Then we can disconnect the isValid node over here and simply plug it in. And then we can grab the, let's see, we want to keep the duration. So we kind of want to plug it in like this. And now we can grab all of this stuff that's already here, and we can cut it. And we want to open our onRepPlayExposedFX. And over here, we can actually just paste it in for now. So let's do it a little bit to the side. So the first thing we're going to do in here is check the actual boolean. So let's grab a branch, and we're going to check if we want to spawn or remove the fx. So if we set it to true, then we want to spawn it. So first of all, we're going to check if it's valid. If it's not valid, we're going to spawn it and then store it in a variable. And if we already have it and we want to delete it, so if this is false, then again, we're going to check if it's actually valid or not. And in this case, if it's valid, we're simply going to destroy it. So we're going to call destroy component and then hook this one up to the isValid pin. So that's all we need to do. Compile and save. And now this fx will replicate in a multiplayer game. So let's move to the side, and over here we also have the targeting beam fx. So we want to do the same thing for that one. We're going to create a rep notify, and we're going to make sure that it's firing this fx in a function. So let's create a new variable and call this play targeting beam fx. Again, we're going to set it to rep notify over here, and now we can drag it into the graph to replace the spawning of the fx. So we're going to grab the pin of the isValid node and then plug this one back into the delay. So make sure we set this to true, so it's actually going to spawn the fx, and then we're going to grab this part and cut it. Let's open our onRepPlayTargetingBeamFX, and first we want to check the boolean to determine what we want to do. So we're going to grab a branch, plug it in. If this is true, then we're gonna spawn the fx and store it in a variable like we already did. And if it's false, then first we want to make sure that it's valid before we delete it. So then we're going to destroy the component again and hook that to the isValid pin. Okay, so that's the second fx out of the way. Let's see, so over here we're not actually spawning any more fx, but we are deleting our targeting beam fx. So over here we don't want to use the destroy component stuff, we just want to grab our rep notify boolean and set it to false. So let's plug it in over here. And make sure we set it back to false, and then we can get rid of this stuff. So that's good to go as well. And we have the fx in here done. So there are a few more inside of this graph, obviously. So we have our start idle state event somewhere. And in here we are deleting the fx that are already present. So we have the exposed fx and the targeting beam fx. We're simply going to add our rep notifies and set them to false. So exposed fx and targeting beam fx, set both of them to false, and that will delete the fx. So get rid of the original stuff, and that's good to go as well. And let me see, what do we have more in here? So we have fx that we're spawning when we are taking damage. So we kind of want to handle that a little bit differently. First of all, let's go to the visual damage fx. So over here, we're spawning the fx if we're taking damage. So we want to take care of this stuff as well. Damage state fx underscore 2 and 1. So let's create booleans for that. Let's call this play damage state fx1. So again, this is going to be a rep notify boolean, and then we can set that one to true in here. So disconnect the isValid pin and make sure we hook it back up to the existing isValid check for damage fx1. So we're going to get back to this in a little bit. So we can grab this stuff and cut it. And let's go to our newly created onRep function, and we are going to do the same trick again. So paste in the stuff that you removed from the graph, and then grab a branch first to check what we want to do in here. So if this is true, hook the original stuff back up, so we're spawning the fx. And if it's false, we're gonna remove it as long as it's valid. Nope. Like so. That's good to go, and we can go back to the event graph. So make sure we actually enable the bool over here, otherwise the fx won't spawn. If we scroll down a little bit more, we have the damage state 1 fx. Oh, okay, so I made a mistake with the name. This was damage state 2. Okay, so that's a downside from onRep variables. If I rename it, the function over here will not fire anymore, and I'm not sure if I actually fix that by renaming this as well. So for now, let's just not worry about the little number over here. We're going to keep this damage state fx1, and let's call this damage state fx0, and that way it kind of matches up again. So let's create a new boolean and call this play damage state fx. And then let's make this 0. So let's turn this one into a rep notify, and in here drag it in and set it to true. So we can grab the existing stuff and move that over to our rep notify function. So check the bool first and plug it in. Spawn the fx if this is true and get rid of it if it's false. No. There we go. So now that we have this one in place, we can go back to the event graph and go back to the first one. So over here, if we're spawning number 2, what used to be number 2, we are deleting number 1, so we can get rid of this one. And over here, simply set our damage state 0, boolean back to false, so this will remove the other fx. So that one is good to go as well. Now let me see, we have the death function that has some fx and the damage. So first let's do the destroy turret one. I think that makes a little bit more sense. So we have destroy turret, and first of all we're checking all the current fx's and deleting them. So we can simply replace all of these with our rep notifies. So we have the damage state fx, we want to set that to false for both of them. Then we have the exposed fx and the targeting beam fx. So we can simply grab all 4 of these bools and make sure that we have these set back to false. And then we don't need all the is valid checks with the destroy component nodes in here anymore. And then hook this one back up here for now, although we're going to disconnect it right away, because in here we're actually spawning fx again. So we want to make this a rep notify. So we're going to add a new one and call this one play destroyed fx. Again, turn it into a rep notify, and we actually want to set it over here. So set it to true, drag it in and replace the spawn emitter at location. So now, because we fired a rep notify, we need to make sure that we give the blueprint some time to actually replicate it. So if we immediately destroy the actor, then the rep notify probably won't fire. So what we could do is just add a delay for something like a second in here and then destroy the actor. So it could be much shorter than a second, but it doesn't really matter anyway. So just add 1 second delay and then destroy the actor. And now we can grab the spawn emitter at location, and we're gonna go for the rep destroyed fx. And in here, first we're gonna spawn the emitter at location. So there's no need to check any bools. We're not gonna delete this fx. It's not a looping fx anyway. So we don't need to store it as a variable either. We do run into one tiny issue. So if we wait to delete the actor for 1 second, then obviously we have the capsule component and the mesh still there when it's being destroyed. So we could destroy the capsule component and the mesh just to make sure nothing shows up. And to do that, we actually want to do that inside of the rep notify for the destroyed fx. And that's because the mesh and the capsule component are not replicated components. So if only the server destroys those, then for the clients, they will still be in the level. So this entire actor over here is set to replicate. So if we would destroy the actor being the server, then that would actually replicate. But if we only destroy a component, then that doesn't work. So over here, replication, by default, a character replicates. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go back into the rep destroyed fx, and here we're going to grab the capsule component and also the mesh, and we're going to destroy those components. So there's nothing to collide with while we are playing the fx. So that should be good to go, and that one is fixed. So we have the event point damage, we have take damage, and inside of our take damage function, we are spawning fx depending on if we have the shield open or not. But the downside over here is that we are actually using a location and rotation that we need to spawn it at the correct location and rotation. So if we want to use a rep notify, it's not impossible, but we, for example, could use a structure that contains both of these variables and make that structure a rep notify variable. But if we do that, the advantage between a rep notify and a multicast is very low. So there's not really any advantage to do it anymore at that point. A rep notify is cheaper as long as there are no actual variables that are passed on inside of this variable, if that kind of makes sense. So in this case, we could just as well use a multicast event, and that will work just fine. So that's what we're going to do in this case. So let's go to our event graph first. And we want to create the multicast event. So let's right click and create a new custom event. So we're going to call this multicast play hit fx. And then we need the branch in here to check if our shield is open or not. So let's grab a branch and our is shield open bool, plug it in over here. And depending on that, we want to spawn the correct fx. So we can go back inside of take damage function and simply grab these nodes. So let's copy this stuff with the rotation from X vector node. We can also use that one. And we can grab it from here, go back to the event graph, paste it in here. So now we don't need to worry about the fx template and the other stuff we need to set up. So that's good to go. We can grab the location and drag it onto the event. Do the same thing for the rotation over here. So for that one, we might want to adjust the name, rotation. And make sure we also plug in the location into the lower pin over here. So that's good to go. And then we can go back inside of our take damage function. And in here, let me see. So let's move this out of the way. We do want to keep our is shield open check to determine how much health we are going to subtract. So we're going to keep that one. But over here, we can call our multicast play hit fx and make sure that we plug in our location and rotation. And then we can get rid of the actual spawn emitter over here. So let's disconnect it and make sure that we can safely remove it. There we go. So that's all of the fx taken care of. And all of the animations. Okay, so it didn't actually update the name, so I need to refresh the node. Now it says rotation and I can plug it back in and that will take care of the error, so nothing bad actually happened. And by the way, we do want to make sure that we actually set the multicast event to replicate as a multicast event. So under the replicates over here, set it to multicast and then it would actually work. Okay, so as I mentioned, animation and fx are fixed. So the next thing that we want to take a look at is the spawning of the projectile. So if we are spawning a blueprint, first of all, let's take a look at the actual blueprint of the projectile. In here, we want to make sure that we go to the class defaults and we need to enable replication in here. So especially because this is a moving projectile, we want to enable not only replication, but also replicate movement. So this will make sure that the movement replicates and it will look the same for the clients and the server. And what we also need to do in here, let me quickly switch my notes. That's not too hard. Actually, we want to make sure that we only have the server destroy the actor. So this will fire on all instances of our projectile. So for that reason, we don't need to worry about actually doing a replication for the spawning of the fx. So this will already be replicated. This apply radial damage with fall off will only fire server side by default, so we don't need to worry about that one. And for destroying of the actor, because this is going to be an actor that is actually replicated and spawned by the server, we also want to make sure that the server is the one destroying it. So over here we're going to grab a branch and simply do an is server check. And if it's true, destroy the actor. So that's all we need to do inside of the actual projectile blueprint. And now we want to go back into our turret. And this kind of overlaps with the next subject that we want to take a look at. And that's make sure that the code actually runs server side. So we want to make sure that the spawning of the projectile is only done by the server. So over here we have the turret fire event. This is triggered by a notify in the animation blueprint. And as I mentioned before, animations blueprint exists on all instances of the character. So this notify event will also fire on all instances of the character. So the plus side is we don't have to worry about spawning this effects because it's already replicated, quote unquote replicated. But we do need to worry about spawning the projectile over here because right now not only the server is trying to spawn it but also all the clients. So in here, before we spawn the projectile, we can simply grab a is server branch and that will take care of the issue. So that's good to go as well. And now we are closing in on the final subject, and that's actually making sure that the code that we are running over here is running server side. And that's not too bad. So let me try and explain. If we go to our turret controller, so this is an AI controller, and an AI controller only exists on the server to begin with. So that's not like a player controller that has to exist on a local instance of the game because there's no local somebody controlling this AI. It just exists in the game and not in the real world. So this only exists on the server, and for that reason, all of the code that we're running and also the behavior tree, the blackboard stuff, perception, all of this stuff only runs server side. And everything that we're calling from our behavior tree, so for example, if we call an event on our turret from the behavior tree, because this runs server side, the event that we call also only runs server side. So this makes things a lot less complicated, to be honest, because we don't have to worry about any of the logic that we put inside of the player controller to replicate it. So all we need to do is go inside of our turret event graph and make sure that we have a few is server checks in place in here, in the few events that are not running server only already. And that's actually going to be event begin play, for example. So if we go in here, event begin play, this will run on all instances of the turret. So we need to make sure that we only execute this on the server. So we can grab a branch in here. And then we're going to add an is server check. So we want to make sure that the server sets the blackboard. The clients don't need to know about it because they don't even have one. And then we also want to make sure that we set our turret damage variation variable. So let's go to the variables over here. And then for the animation blueprint, we have a turret damage variation. So we want to set this once when the turret spawns, and this will determine the variation of damage. So if you have multiple turrets in your level, they will look slightly different when they are damaged. And you want to make sure that you set this as a replicated variable, so it will look the same for the client and the host. So we're going to set this on begin play and simply grab a random integer in range. And we have 4 variations, so we can choose between 0 and 3. Hook this one up over here. That's good to go. Now we can take advantage of our is server branch over here to make sure that we only fire our event tick on the server side. So if we look at our event tick over here, what we're doing in tick is only setting 2 variables that are used in the animation blueprint, and those are replicated, so they need to be set by the server anyway. So there's no point in the clients actually running event tick. So what we can do in begin play over here, if we are not the server, we're simply going to disable tick. So drag off here and set actor tick enabled and then set it to false. So that will make sure that's cleaned up. And now let me see, we already added the branch before spawning the projectile. Now we have a second event that is called by a notify from the animation blueprint, and that's our turret fire end over here. So this will also execute on all instances, and we don't want that to happen because that will mess up our code. So we're simply going to add an isServer check in here. Branch isServer is true. So the clients won't mess with the code in here. So that's done, and I think we are pretty much there. Double checking quickly. So our destroy turret event is actually being called from our take damage, and that runs server side, so that shouldn't be an issue. So this should pretty much be everything. So if we compile and save it, there's one small thing left to do if we go inside of the animation blueprint. So that's turrets, turret inhibitors, animations, and then all the way down. So previously we were setting the damage variation variable in here on the event graph, initialize animation. So we're simply going to delete it over here. We moved it to the turret character, and the server is replicating it for us. Now there's one final thing that we can take a look at to make sure that we can actually test this properly. So if we go to the third person character blueprint where we set up the actual firing. So we want to make sure that if we are the client, we also apply damage, and the normal apply point damage event should be called by the server. So previously we had it set up without the switch has authority over here. So for you guys, it should look like this. So what we want to do before we apply the actual damage is check if we are the server or not. So that's why we have the has authority node over here. We're going to plug that in. If we have authority, we can apply point damage ourselves. And otherwise, we need to make sure that the server does it for us. So then we can create a custom event. I've called it server apply damage, and then make sure you set the replication over here to run on server. So we can pass on the hit result. So you can just drag on the hit info to the event, and that will create the variable. And then you can just copy the nodes from here. So the apply point damage and the break hit result, and hook everything up. So I'll just leave it on screen for a second so you can see how everything is wired up. And then over here, if we are a client, we actually want to call our server replicated event, so that way the damage will actually register. So if we set it up like this, we should be able to do a proper test in this project as well. So that should actually be all. So right now we can test in multiplayer. So I have the number of players set to 2, and I've changed the net mode to a listen server. So we have one client and one host. So let's hit play and see what happens. Here we go. So the left side is the client. So we probably want to make sure the client works. The host should work anyway. And as you can see, everything is replicating properly right now. So we have the animations playing, the FX, and the projectile is actually spawning. So everything seems to be good. Now we should be able to fire with the client and damage the turret. And that seems to be working as well. So we see a little hit react animation, and there's also damage FX playing. And it also explodes, so that should be good. And if we fire at the turret while it's closed, he should have a different impact animation, impact FX, and that seems to be working as well. So let's grab the host just to make sure. Shooting works. And if the turret fires at us, that seems to be working as well. So I think we have everything set up properly and good to go for a multiplayer game. Now there is one tiny little trick that I want to show you, and that's to determine if something is actually firing on the server, for example, or on all instances of that character. You can simply use a print. So for example, if I go in my turret over here and go to my event begin play, so that should be over here somewhere. So I'm not going to add any branches or things like that. I'm simply going to add a print in here that says hello. And let me up the duration so we can see it a little bit better. So right now, if I launch a 2-player game, you will see 2 times hello, one on the server instance and one on the client instance. So there's 2 instances of the turret over here. We have 2 instances of the game, and each game has 1 turret. And both of those instances are firing begin play, as you saw by the print over here. And if I would do the same thing for onPossessed, for example, so if I look for event onPossessed, this is a character, so this should have, event possessed, I'm sorry. And if we add a print in here, then you will see it only fires for the server. So if I launch it right now, it will only say hello 1 time, and that's only for the server side. So that's a pretty easy way to check where an event is firing. If you're not sure, simply add a print, and if you launch it in the editor, it will also add a prefix for server, client, and all of that stuff. So you can easily determine where everything is executing. Okay, so I think that's all I got for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please consider leaving a like. We're probably going to take a look at 1 or 2 small things for the turret and then move on to a new sort of AI. So, thanks for watching.